On a perfect, almost achingly beautiful late summer morning in early September 2001, a day of seemingly infinite visibility, one man later said, characterized by the rare and exquisite flying conditions airline pilots call severe clear. Life in New York and much of the rest of the contemporary world was changed irrevocably in the space of less than 2 hours.
In my years in New York, there's obviously nothing like it. Nothing comes close. As a newspaperman, I've seen other horrors, wars and the earthquake in Mexico in '85, which killed 20,000 people. But that was an act of nature, not of man. The combination of the death, the spectacular event of the two skyscrapers collapsing, and the motivations behind it, all those things, I think, made this something that just struck a knife right into the heart of every New Yorker, knowing that we'd never be able to look at our city the same way again.
First of all, it's a surprise on a beautiful day at the center of this powerful nation, which has not been attacked on its own shores or its own land by a foreign power in almost 200 years. So that's a new thing. Secondly, the public focus on this. Never in the history of the world had there been anything even close. There's not really a second place. The second place would probably be the assassination of President Kennedy. You know, a world event where the world is focused on that story, but nothing like this, where it's seen instantaneously as it happens by tens of millions of people around the globe.
In a little less than 2 hours, with an almost poetically horrifying symmetry, the symbols and instruments of the city's uniquely air-minded culture, and of globalization itself, skyscrapers, jets, and the mass media, would be turned back against themselves with a devastatingly lethal impact and effect.
We were utterly struck by the fact that nothing here fit with any prior experience. I mean, of course, people were talking about how it looked like something in a disaster movie. We could only think in terms of life imitating art because we had no other thing to compare it to. So people went to the movies and compared it.
Around 8:45 a.m. on the morning of September 11th, 2001, people along the west side of Manhattan heard the piercing whine of a jet plane moving south down the Hudson. Everything about its trajectory was wrong. Heading south along an airway normally reserved for northbound traffic, it was moving much too fast and much too close to the ground, nearly 500 miles per hour at an altitude of just 900 feet, more than twice the speed permitted for aircraft that low. It took less than 90 seconds for American Airlines Flight 11 to hurtle the entire length of Manhattan Island. A little after 8:46 a.m., the huge 137-ton Boeing 767, measuring more than half a football field in length from wingtip to wingtip, and carrying more than 9,000 gallons of highly inflammable jet fuel, flashed across the final 20 blocks from Canal Street to the World Trade Center, and tore through the north wall of the North Tower between the 94th and 98th floors. Instantly killing everyone on board and wreaking incomprehensible carnage across 5 full floors of the building. Witnesses on the upper floors of the South Tower were stunned to see a wall of flame burst through the south windows of Tower 1, 130 feet away, followed by a shower of disintegrating desks, files, furniture, computer terminals, airplane parts, and burning bodies.
If you were just below where the plane hit, your ceilings fell, you saw the glint of the plane going overhead, there's an overwhelming feeling of terror, and you were probably knocked off your feet. And of course, if you were in the zone itself, you may have died instantly, but even very close, and this is very tragic, very close to the regions of impact, there were people who lived for long minutes as they sought refuge from, the building flames, the tremendous heat. A couple of them even were able to phone. And then often in that region, their lives ended quickly in the fire, or they chose to leap from the tower.
That airplane straddled several floors, and it delivered a hell of a punch. The building swayed. We know that when that punch was delivered, the swaying took the form of waves that ran vertically up and down the building multiple times, sort of echoing up and down the building. And really the incredible thing is, considering the speed with which those airplanes were flying, enormous weight, enormous speed. Rather than decapitating the buildings or pushing them over, the buildings absorbed the impact entirely. They took the hit and they stood.
I was heading for the Holland Tunnel, which has a 4-block concourse, if you want to call it, leading to the toll booth. And as I turned into the first of those 4 blocks and I looked up, I said, oh my God, there was a hole in tower number 1. And my first thought was, it can't be a helicopter, the hole's too big. And the second was, my God, it can't be a commercial plane, because they're instructed to fly into the river if they have problems. I knew that.
By 8:55, an army of firemen, police officers, emergency medical personnel, and government officials, including the mayor himself, had begun to descend on Lower Manhattan, along with an army of reporters, photographers, and television crews, as the machinery of the largest media apparatus in the world began to focus on the 16-acre site. At 9:02 a.m., little more than 15 minutes after the attack, millions of people in the metropolitan region, and tens of millions more across the country and around the world, were staring intently at the smoldering skyline of Lower Manhattan, when a dark shape appeared on the horizon above the New Jersey lowlands and came hurtling across the upper bay.
I got out of my car, other people did, and suddenly I saw plane number 2 coming from the south over the Statue of Liberty, going very fast, they say between 500 and 600 miles an hour. And I saw it smash into the south wall of number 2 in an oblique angle. I saw this big ball of flame, and the nose came out on the north side and the east side. My first reaction, my God, there's poor people above, because they're going to wipe out all the staircases and all the sprinkler systems. That airplane just went sliced right through it. And the power of such a big plane at that speed. And for a moment, incredible sadness for the people there, and then an incredible anger, feeling that somebody had deliberately rammed into those towers and those poor innocent people that were in there.
I was at the Tweed Courthouse on Chambers Street, right behind City Hall. I grabbed a notebook and ran to the street in time to see the second one hit. I knew right away, obviously, it was terrorism, this amazing fireball that came roaring towards Broadway. And people on the street corner just going, oh, shit, oh, shit, oh, shit. That expression must have been uttered like 10 million times that day. Just astonishment at what they were looking at.
We know that when the airplanes hit, there was an instantaneous release of energy in the form of fuel vaporized that caught on fire. There was fire instantaneously across multiple floors. That fire, which was a kerosene fire, jet fuel fire, burned very hot, but it also burned very fast. We're talking 3 to 5 minutes. But what it did is it ignited a simultaneous office fire, in both cases, across multiple floors. An office fire the like of which had not been imagined before. In all cases, an office fire is many things burning, partitions, carpets in particular, computer cases, but paper, mostly paper. And if you look at the dynamics of the collapse, what you find is that in both cases, it was the paper fire that was sustained long enough because of the amount of paper in there to cause the steel to weaken, to cause the collapse and the hammering down in both cases. I mean, paper on that day was a constant presence. It rained down on the city as if in mockery of the kind of business that was done at the Trade Center. Here, have some of the paper. And it burned, and it brought the buildings down.
The second plane had struck the South Tower at 9:02:54 a.m., just 16 minutes after the first plane went in. By then, the first teams of firemen and rescue workers had already arrived at the foot of the North Tower, where they were greeted by a scene of horror and devastation that defied the imagination. On the Austin Tobin Plaza, there were corpses everywhere. The mangled bodies of men and women who had already jumped or fallen from the upper floors of the building, and the charred remains of passengers from Flight 11, some still belted into their seats. Far above, meanwhile, in the upper reaches of the towers themselves, the gaping black holes where the planes had gone in marked a stark dividing line between life and death.
In the North Tower, the plane struck at the center, and it also struck much higher up. And because it struck at the center, the fuel immediately went down the shafts and created a much broader fire. The flames were much more intense. The number of floors that were available to move up and down were many fewer. So what happened was people were breaking windows in the North Tower, desperate to get air, and there was no place to go because there were no stairwells that were open up and down. People were stacked 4 or 5 on top of each other at the broken windows, desperate to breathe. And other people were hanging on to each other across the steel columns from window to window, hanging out of the windows, desperate to breathe, and just, grasping each other to keep hold of the building.
One of the most horrific scenes in the history of the nation took place 1,000 feet above Lower Manhattan. And it took the lives of people who were staring down at safety, at the most populous city in the nation, civilization at its peak. But they didn't have anywhere to get there. And there's really few words to describe how terrible that must have been.
By 9:30, ordinary life had all but ceased across the city, as millions of New Yorkers and hundreds of millions more around the world looked on in shock and disbelief at the nightmarish images unfolding in real time on TV.
You usually can gauge things, within a few minutes, so that they may start getting worse. But at one time you say, well, this is what they are. But this was something that started getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
At 9:38, word came that terrorists had commandeered a third jetliner and crashed it into the Pentagon, killing everyone on board and 126 people on the ground. And not long after, that a fourth plane had crashed into a hillside in rural Pennsylvania, brought down by some of its own heroic passengers before it could reach its intended target in the nation's capital.
What struck me at the time, I think, is the most significant part of that, was when they came on and said that the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all air traffic in the United States to be grounded. I knew that had never happened before. There are tens of thousands of planes in the United States at any one time, and to say they have to land now. What hit me was that this is really beyond whatever I had thought.
And then, on a morning of hideous surprises, already without precedent in the city's history, something happened that no one had ever thought possible before. Something beyond comprehension, something that had never happened in the history of tall buildings, since the first skyscrapers had gone up at the foot of Manhattan over a century before. High up in both towers, the raging fires were now generating 3 to 5 times the heat of a nuclear power plant, and the interior temperature had soared in places to nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At 9:58 a.m., having withstood the ferocious heat of the inferno within for nearly an hour, the floor trusses on the 80th floor of the South Tower began to give way. Columns along the east wall began to buckle outwards, and the entire building began to come down. As the quarter-mile-tall structure dissolved into a massive shroud of smoke and dust, thousands of people in the surrounding streets began to cry out in horror and disbelief, then ran for their lives, pursued by an enormous billowing cloud of dust and debris.
It never occurred to me that these two buildings would come down. So that when they did, it was the most shocking moment maybe that I've ever had. That the South Tower began to tip forward and then righted itself and came down in what in memory seems like a slow motion moment. What happened in 10 seconds. 10 seconds. It's a knockout in boxing. The whole thing came down. It was just, to me, still, it's a staggering moment in New York, in any history, in world history, for a place that had never had anything like that happen to it ever before. The Empire State Building didn't come down. You couldn't. 93, the 4,000-pound bomb goes off in the basement, doesn't come down. This time it came down. This time they figured it out. And I thought, oh man, something new's happened here.
At 10:28 a.m., 30 minutes after the South Tower fell, the television antenna atop the North Tower began to give way, followed a fraction of a second later by the upper floors of the building itself, as the entire North Tower now came down too.
And there was a release of heat that was off the scale. Fires ignited. Crushing and tearing was going on. And chaos, mostly just chaos, on some mathematical level was happening. You can't even describe it physically because it was too big, too chaotic. It was a cataclysmic release. And it released back into the city in 10 seconds in each case. The surprising thing to me has always been how concentrated it was. They came straight down as if they were aimed directly at their foundations. And of course, anything that was directly underneath no longer existed afterward. The so-called bathtub that ran 6 floors underground below street absorbed the brunt of the energy. Inside that bathtub during those twin 10-second pulses, what was really happening, nobody can even imagine. We know what the results were. The results were, we were grappling with results inside that hole for the following 9 months. We're, in a sense, probably will be grappling with the results for years to come.
I was upstate New York when I heard of the towers being destroyed. A side of me was not believing it. It was a very strange blend of feelings. One was the sorrow, the horror at witnessing human life being obliterated for no reason like that. And I felt something beyond words. I felt almost an alive part of me being squeezed to nothing, being extracted, and evisceration almost. It's an interesting question when you saw those two giant towers collapse almost cleanly on themselves. Where did they go? I have read in some architecture article that they were made mostly of air. If you consider the space between the solid molecules, the steel, the concrete, the glass, the aluminum, there was a lot of air. It was mostly air, actually. And they disappeared, and it's... where did they go was part of the disbelief that I was feeling, because how you can make 200,000 tons of steel disappear, it's unbelievable.
In the end, the 500,000 tons of concrete, steel, glass, and aluminum in each tower had hurtled to the ground in a virtual freefall, traveling at a speed of 125 miles an hour. Shock waves from the twin impacts were picked up more than 40 miles away by seismic instruments used for monitoring earthquakes. The immense columns of rubble and dust drifting away from ground zero could be clearly seen from outer space.
I have to tell you, I didn't know whether the buildings were empty or whether there were tens of thousands of people in them. I just had no idea, and I was totally devastated by the fact that all those people were in there, and this building that I had designed was perhaps falling on them. The buildings were not so important to me. I'm good at buildings, but people are another matter. It was a terrible event. Absolutely terrible.
I don't think you can measure the impact. It's absolutely enormous. Everybody felt it, but of course those who felt it most and will never get over the effects are those who lost people. And the sheer numbers are so appalling, and the horror of the attack is so appalling that in one sense, New York will never be the same.
With the collapse of the second tower, an eerie quiet descended on New York. By 11 o'clock, hundreds of thousands of dazed and disheveled office workers, many covered in ashes and dust, could be seen marching north from the financial district, straggling uptown along the West Side Highway, or heading over the bridges to Brooklyn. Down at the site itself, hundreds of firemen and rescue workers groped their way across a surreal landscape of smoke and flames, at the edge of an immense 7-story pile of tangled steel and debris, searching desperately for any signs of life. All day, doctors and nurses in emergency rooms around the city braced for the anticipated onslaught of injured survivors that never came. Those who got out, one nurse later said. Those who didn't, died.
The story of all the firefighters is dramatic. What struck me about Rescue 2 in Brooklyn is that even though a little firehouse set out kind of in the middle of the Brooklyn borough, they were at the World Trade Center when the second plane hit. And since that's only about 16 minutes, they had to take, a minute, let's take a minute or two before the alarm to go out. It's got to take you another minute or something to get your shoes on and to get on the truck. And then to go through Brooklyn at rush hour in the morning and go through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel and be at the World Trade Center in 12 minutes. By the way, where they all died, is an incredible story.
Around 5:20 in the afternoon, building number 7, a 47-story tower on the north side of Vesey Street, succumbed to a raging oil fire within and fell to the ground.
One of the surprising things, you could call it almost a sad poetic justice, is that the only buildings that were completely destroyed by this collapse were the buildings that carried the Trade Center label, buildings 1 through 7. No other buildings, with the exception of the small Orthodox church there that dissolved were destroyed, and every building that carried the label died.
We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy.
No doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated.
New York City has pulled up the drawbridge. Every crossing to Manhattan Island is closed. The financial heart of the world's only superpower evacuated.
Night fell, and an end finally came to the most harrowing day in the city's history. Across the city, friends and family members of those thought to have been in the towers continued to roam the streets or make the rounds of hospital emergency rooms, anxiously looking for loved ones who would not come home. When asked on television about the future of his city, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani replied without hesitation. "We're going to rebuild," he said. "We're going to come out of this emotionally stronger, politically stronger, much closer together as a city. And we're going to come out of this economically stronger too. The people of New York City will be whole again."
The day itself was a horror. And yet that day itself, when, the president couldn't be found, there was the mayor down at the site helping solve the way to think about it. When he was asked about how many casualties there would be, and he said, "More than any of us can bear," that was the most important sentence by a public figure, because it puts sorrow into the story, not just empty rage, not just let's go kill somebody back, which a lot of people felt, including me. But he created a note there that said, wait a minute, we have to think about this as humans and what it did to human beings.
Initial estimates of the number of dead ranged as high as 20,000. In the weeks and months to come, the number would steadily dwindle until the final confirmed toll of those who died in the attack on the World Trade Center stood at 2,792 men, women, and children, including the 156 passengers and crew on board the two doomed aircraft. In the end, it had been the second deadliest day in American history, surpassing the casualties of Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and all the battles of the Civil War, except Antietam. Included in the overall total was one particularly staggering figure. 343 members of the New York Fire Department had lost their lives that day, including much of the department's top leadership. No fire department in history had ever suffered anything remotely like it.
We lost all those firemen. We lost police. We had this fantastic contradiction of people who hated you so much that they were willing to give up their life to take yours, and people who loved humanity so much that they were willing to run into the darn building in the smoke and flame and just to save the life of somebody they never met. And that's ineffably beautiful. There's no better definition of love. There's no more inspirational, no more inspiring, no more near to saintly conduct that you can think of than what they demonstrated.
But I'll never forget where I was, and I'll never forget that day. And I remember taking a bus home at night at about 11:30 at Amsterdam and 116th Street. And how quiet the street was. There was an eerie silence like nothing I'd seen in more than 30 years of working there. And I remember a huge truck coming south on Amsterdam with a yellow flashing light. And as it moved past, you could see it was a giant truck carrying earth-moving equipment, obviously heading for the World Trade Center site. And then I remember when the bus came that there was a sign around the little box there that said, "No fare today." I remember sitting on the bus, sitting opposite a young woman who was just crying. And I remember when I got off the bus at 83rd Street, she was still crying. I remember just putting my hand on her shoulder. And I said nothing, and she said nothing, and I got off. But I'll always remember that woman.
Went back that night in the middle of this ghastly scene where you could still see the fires burning at the end of the street. Everything was dark with these huge buildings, all black silhouetted against black. And as the first lights began to get hooked up, and they're sort of crude halogen lamps, in come a lot of these cars from different places. And the first time you began to see the ironworkers, the hard hats, showing up with their tools, with their hats, and saying, "We cut steel, you're gonna need us." And I knew that night that we're gonna be all right. This was like some moment in the Blitz where citizens came out and began to dig the rubble. And these guys knew what to do. They were professionals. Some of them, I'm sure, that showed up in the next couple of days had helped put the towers up. And they had lived long enough now to see them come down. They knew how they were put together, and they were going to help deconstruct the rubble.
On the morning of Wednesday, September 12, 2001, New Yorkers woke to what was perhaps the bleakest dawn in the city's long history. Overnight, the reality of what had happened had begun to sink in, and hope that many could have survived the twin collapses had all but vanished. The numbers were simply unimaginable, and as the mayor had said, more than anyone could bear. One financial firm in the North Tower, Cantor Fitzgerald, had lost nearly 700 people. The Port Authority, which had built the vast complex, and whose offices had occupied 18 floors in Tower 1, had lost 84 people, including its own director.
We know that many Port Authority people were killed. We know that the entire headquarters was wiped out. This was, for the people within the Port Authority, a blow of unbelievable dimensions psychologically.
It was overwhelming. I mean, it was really overwhelming. No one, we build libraries. I build, $40 million sewer, water main, road projects. This is way beyond anything I had ever come in contact with, anything that I had ever experienced at all. And this obviously was very, very disturbing and just extraordinarily sad.
Though the exact number would not be known for months, nearly 3,000 people lay buried within an apocalyptic wasteland of tangled steel and concrete, rising in places to jagged peaks more than 8 stories high and smoldering with subterranean fires. And yet, from that sorrowful, daunting landscape, something extraordinary would begin to emerge from the very start. Something that spoke of the very best that the city and country were capable of and stood for.
That we were able then, in the following 8 months, to clear more than 1 million tons of steel and rubble and human bodies and remains and all that, and do that in 8 months without losing a single person, was to me this amazing human triumph. That we're able to say, We had this terrible day in our history, and we're going to distinguish ourselves by the way we solve it. And I think the city has never been better than it was in the way it went about the after part. I mean, it was a gigantic improvisation. There was no script. And they found the script. You know, they knew how to do it. Everything in their lives in some way must have led to that 16 acres in Lower Manhattan, where they proved the value of what they do for a living, but also the sheer intelligence that's behind it. And this is a place that demanded intelligence and got it. And got it in a way that, that we'll be proud of for generations.
Over the next 9 months, the unbuilding of the World Trade Center, a feat of improvised urban renewal unlike anything the city had ever seen, would rival and in some ways surpass the extraordinary collective achievement that had raised it into the sky. Week after week, month after month, the vast chaos of the pile slowly receded as an army of iron workers, crane operators, demolition experts, and engineers grimly soldiered on, working around the clock in shifts of 8 to 12 hours, a Herculean effort made incalculably more difficult by the fact that the worksite was also a burial ground.
I mean, it was a horrible place to work. It was a horrible place to work. We were putting milled asphalt, you know, to kind of build a road and flatten certain areas, put dirt over the debris so we could bring trucks in and whatnot. And to have a firefighter come up and say, you know, look, I'm sure my son is in this pile of debris here. Could you just give me a couple of hours and I'll search through this? And then out of the corner of your eye to see this guy standing on the pile with a spade. I mean, he had a typical gardening spade and was searching for his son by getting spadefuls of debris and lifting it to his nose to smell, to see if he could smell, you know, putrefying flesh. Put a human face on a tragedy that's very haunting.
On the Memorial Day, a year later, Mayor Bloomberg asked a number of people to read some of the names of those who had been killed at the World Trade Center. And while we were waiting to go out, I talked with one of these people who was going to read, and he told me this story.
Richard Anthony
He said, I was in Wisconsin when the attack occurred, and as it was happening, I knew, said he, my daughter was at that very moment in a job interview with her employer in the trade tower, and I went crazy, you know, in pain and so forth. As he's telling me this story, I'm reliving it now. I began to cry. He said, we tried to get a plane commercial, we couldn't. We tried to get a private plane, we couldn't. And finally, we got into New York. And we went down to the site. We were taken over by a cop who will never be forgotten by us. He's now a member of our family. And he took us everywhere. We went to 38 places looking for our daughter. And we knew she was dead. At that moment, Senator Hillary Clinton saw me, and she motioned me to come over. And she said, "You look terrible. What's wrong?" I said, "I'm sitting with the father of a young woman who was killed. I began to cry again. Cry again. But it's like a personal, tremendous loss. And what the father said was he was so proud of New York and appreciative. He said, I can't tell you how I appreciate what the mayor did. I told him, I can't just sit here, I have to work. I have to do something. And he said, sure, you must work. And he embraced me. He said, I'll never forget him. Well, I'll never forget him either. And the pain that he went through, and it's just incredible. And the strength that he displayed.
Teilhard de Chardin, a great French Jesuit paleontologist and a philosopher, said that one of the tricks in life is to convert everything into good. He makes the reference to the stone. You're a sculptor and you have a stone and the stone has a scar in it. And well, all right, so now you have to sculpt around that scar, and you've got to use that scar to make it part of whatever it is you're going to produce that's beautiful. And work with what you have, play it as it lies, you know. So whatever the circumstance, you know, use it for good purpose. 9/11, how can you possibly use it for good purpose? You think about it. You think, as we've suggested before, you think about, look, what this reminds you of is the importance of your own life and making the most of it, because you can lose it in a flash. And if that's all you learned from 9/11, if that's all you remembered, that, my God, you could extinguish life so suddenly, so unexpectedly, and it could happen to me, and therefore I should think harder about the way I spend my life instead of just wasting it. Now, it's not going to teach you what to do with your life, but it will teach you to do with your life, and to do it more and quicker and better. And that can be extremely valuable. It's had that effect on me.
We are never going to be exactly the same again, those of us who lived through this. We can't be. In the same way that if you lived through the Kennedy assassination or other, cataclysmic events that had just a powerful, wrenching emotional effect on people, you are not quite the same. But everything isn't really different either. There is a glorious, comforting power to normalcy that ultimately pushes its way back in. It's kind of like you can do anything you want in the sand on the beach, but ultimately the tides will sort of work their effect on it and smooth it over. And sometimes we almost don't want to let it do its work because we fear that in some way maybe that's disrespectful of those who died or those who suffered so much, to let normalcy come back. But ultimately, it's the law of nature, in fact, that normalcy return. I think it's also true that there is a fundamental kind of New Yorkness that cannot be destroyed by even as cataclysmic an event as this. And our day-to-day business ultimately came back. The business of living, the feeling of living, what city life is like. And that was not destroyed by 9/11. It's in fact the New York equivalent of the tides. It's just there, and ultimately it sort of works its magic of normalcy again. But we will never be exactly as we were. And that's right. It would be wrong to deny the enormity of what's happened. But that doesn't mean everything changes as a result.
I really like them, I really like them. I miss them. I see them right now. None of the other buildings had the power and presence of those towers.
When you ask someone what they'd like to see there, I know that the answer to that question is something you and I have not thought of, something that has far more dimension, far more connection with the city, far more beauty and utility, far more originality than we're capable of dreaming of.
But should one build tall? Yes, I think so. Otherwise, the forces of darkness will have won. I mean, they were attacking our ability to challenge the sky ever since the biblical times. To build tall has been both the arrogance of man and the confidence of man. So we must build again.
Not 110 floors, but not 109 either, maybe 111 or whatever. And I don't care whether it's the tallest building in the world or not. I don't think that's the issue. But I would like to see there a symbol of the city of New York that is as strong or stronger than the symbol that was there before.
I would like to see some depiction of all the religions. List them all. Atheism, ethical, humanism, Catholicism, etc., all of them. And you'll notice that each of those religions, these value systems, have two principles they share in common. And the two principles started with monotheism and the Jews. Tzedakah and Tikkun Olam. Tzedakah means generally we must treat one another as brother and sister. We should show one another respect and dignity because we are like things. We are human beings in a world that has nothing else like us. And we are to treat one another with love, charity, use your own words. And the second principle is, well, what do you do with this relationship? Well, we don't know exactly how we got here, why we got here, etc., etc. That's for minds larger than ours. But we know that we are like kinds, and we should work together to make this as good an experience as possible. Tikkun Olam, let us repair the universe. Now, Islam believes that. Buddhism, that has no God, believes it. Every ethical humanist I ever met believes it. Those two principles, we're supposed to love one another, and we're supposed to work together to make the experience better. That's all the religion you need, really, to make a success of this planet. And I'd like to see that in 9/11 somewhere. I'd like to see that captured somehow.